Welcome to the top 8 parts of the brain. I'm going to do a quick intro, but if you want to get right to the parts of the brain, here they are. Spoilers, these are the top 8 parts of the brain. First, I want to talk a little bit about what makes an important part of the brain. What logic did I use to say that one part is better than another part? And what even is a part of the brain? I used a very simple rule to determine how important a part of the brain was, which is simply its size. Because if it's not so important, how come it's so big? Seems logical to me. No reason to get fancy there. But what makes a part? Well, parts of the brain were determined long, long ago, when ancient anatomists would take a brain of, well, probably not a volunteer, but maybe an executed criminal, and they'd start cutting into it, and they would come across pieces that looked like they might be something, and then this ancient anatomist would give it a name, usually based on what it's shaped like or maybe its location in the brain, even though they had no idea what it actually did. Which is why you'll see the meaning of some of these names are things like chamber or almond or seahorse. Or sometimes, based on their location, one of those 8 parts is below the chamber. Which is why we shouldn't be surprised if we find out that this particular part maybe isn't an actual part. Maybe it's a whole bunch of smaller parts just squished together into something that looks like a part. Or opposite, maybe what we think is one part is actually just a part of a larger structure. It just has a funny shape. Still, I appreciate the work of the ancient anatomists. Somebody had to get the ball rolling, and this was not easy work. So we will keep calling these structures by their traditional names, even if today what we know now means maybe those names don't make that much sense, but we have to call it something. For example, there's a part of the brain called the pituitary. That means secreting phlegm. Phlegm was really important back in the day. It was one of the 4 bodily humors. So maybe a phlegm-secreting organ was a good thing. We know now the pituitary is an important part of the endocrine system, and it doesn't have anything to do with phlegm, but we have to call it something. So pituitary, I suppose, is good enough. As I go through each part and how important it is, I will be going in most important to least important, or largest to smallest. And each one I'm going to give you their name, what the name means, its shape and location and size, and if this breaks, what happens? What can't we do any longer if we lose this part of the brain? Judging function based on damage to the brain, it doesn't necessarily tell us what something does. For example, a structure in the brain could be just one part of a cycle or a process that at any point, if it is broken, that entire process breaks down, even if maybe that one particular point didn't have anything to do specifically with the end result. Maybe it was just in charge of generating prerequisite information, or maybe it's just connecting two things that need to work together to produce a result. We don't know. Also, if a structure in the brain breaks, its effects can be difficult to observe. If it's incredibly important, you may just go unconscious or die, and then we'll have no idea what it does. If we do animal studies, it can be difficult to ask the animals what they're thinking, which makes it a little easier for humans, but also there are more ethical problems of deliberately damaging people's brains to see what happens. We're going to avoid that. But it can happen due to disease, stroke, injury, and even congenital defects. All of the information that I'm giving you, I have done my best to make sure there are rigorous sources. I've included them in the description. Please double check me. If I am wrong, let me know. And now, finally, the parts. The number one part of the brain is the cerebral cortex. It's important because it comprises 80% of the total brain. The term cerebral cortex is from the Latin, meaning brain bark. So, if your brain were a tree, the cortex would be its bark. It's tree bark, not dog bark. It's called the bark of the brain because it covers the entire brain, though it's very shallow. Let's see if we can see a good example. Here I inked some in. About 2.5 millimeters on the outside is the cortex. Though you could see it's not only on the outside. There are deep wrinkles because we need more cortex than is the actual size of our brain. If we didn't have those wrinkles, our brain would have to be 3 times the volume. That would look funny. So to keep us from having the bulbous heads of an alien freak, we have these wrinkles so that we can fit more bark inside of our brain. The cortex is made out of gray matter, which are nerve cell bodies. But even more of the full cerebrum is white matter, which are essentially connections between the cortex and other parts of the brain. You can think of the white matter as the wires that connect the different parts of the brain. So what happens if the cortex is damaged? Well, there's a lot of cortex, so different things happen if different parts of the cortex are damaged. And what we can find is that if we damage one part, we see it affects motor control. Another part can affect sensory processing, or speech, or memory, or thought. It seems like the cerebral cortex is involved with almost every major process of the brain, even though it all looks the same. Just looking at a brain, you can't tell the difference between the part of the cortex that controls motor skills and the part of the cortex that allows you to understand words. In fact, sometimes it is called the homotypic cortex because everything looks exactly the same. It's a very generic, almost universal cell structure involved with incredibly different mental processes, which can give the cortex an amazing ability called neuroplasticity. Because the cortex is structured so similar, almost any part of the cortex that is damaged is a recoverable injury. Creatures with cerebral cortexes can relearn things. Often people will say that the brain is neuroplastic. In reality, the cortex is neuroplastic. If you damage your brainstem, that ain't growing back. The fact of this universal generic structure is so important to such diverse mental processes is amazing. I'm not sure what it means, but it's quite mysterious. We should look into that more. The second most important part of the brain is the cerebellum. It's these little green things back here. They're not green in real life. It's just so that we could clearly see them. And I say it's the second most important because it makes up 11% of the brain. Though if we measure this by number of nerve cells, it is the most important. Half of all nerve cells in the brain are in the cerebellum, 4 times more than in the cerebral cortex. Cerebellum means little brain. And look, it does kind of look like a little brainette. Compact, easy to use. Almost all of these parts of the brain that we're discussing, they come in pairs. You do not have one cerebellum. You have 2 cerebellums, or cerebella. That would make a really nice baby name. But anyhow, whether you call them cerebella or cerebellums, there is a left one and a right one. If they break, what happens to you? In 2010, a case was reported of a 59-year-old patient with almost total cerebellar agenesis. Their cerebellum did not form during normal embryonic growth. This patient showed a number of abnormalities in her ocular motor, speech, and gait control. She had never learned to read or write, and her speech developed late and was slurred. She showed poor dexterity and severely disturbed predictive control of object grasp. Well, the good news is you'll survive. You'll be just as smart as you were before, but you will lose the ability to make complex and coordinated movements. Number 3, the brain stem. The brain stem makes up about 2.6% of the average human brain. If the cortex is the bark of the brain, then the stem is kind of its trunk. The brain is, I guess, like a tree, I suppose. There is only one of them. You do not get a second brainstem like you do with the cerebellum. And if it is damaged, you're not going to recover. Because what the brainstem does is so simple and critical, we can tell a lot from very specific damage. For example, we know that the brainstem is part of the spinal cord. All pathways, whether it's senses coming from the body into the brain, or it is signals coming from the brain to tell the body what to do, all pass through the brainstem. Also, behaviors incredibly important to survival are in your brainstem. It controls heartbeat, breathing, the eye blink reflex, vomiting. It's what gets to decide whether or not you lose your lunch. It controls blood pressure. It controls the pupil response, which is why you see if you're watching a medical show, they'll shine a light in people's eyes to see if the pupil is responding. That is an indicator if the brainstem is damaged or not. But do not call the behaviors that the brainstem controls lower brain functions. These are not low. They are not lesser. These are the kind of behaviors that are so critically important that if we were allowed to think about them, we would probably not survive. If I had to consciously will my heart to beat, I doubt I would make it 24 hours. Let us not look down on the simplicity of the brainstem. It is responsible for some of the most critically important but involuntary types of behavior. The fourth most important part of the brain is the thalamus. The cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, most people are familiar with those. Now we're going to explore into territory of parts that I think the average person isn't very familiar with. And the thalamus is one of the most important. It takes up about 1.2% of the volume of the brain, so it is a significant size. The word thalamus comes from the Greek word meaning chamber or bedroom. It doesn't look like a chamber, it just looks like a couple of blobs. There are 2 thalamuses, or thalami, I suppose, if you want to be fancy, and they sit just above the brainstem. If the thalamus is damaged, the most common consequence is coma and death. But if smaller parts of the thalamus are broken, we can learn a little about what it does. We know that, like the brainstem, the pathway for all senses coming into the brain and motor signals exiting the brain pass through the thalamus. So that's important as well for obvious reasons. But we can also tell from connections certain parts of the thalamus are involved in motor processing. They connect to the cerebellum and other areas of the brain that control your actions. We know that the front part of the thalamus is critical for creating long-term memories. And we know that there are several areas of the thalamus that process visual information. Looking deeper into the thalamus as a part, we find that it's not really one part. It is an example of several, at least 3, but probably more, unrelated structures in the brain that just are stuck together into one blob. It's a convenient spot right there at the middle of the brain. Makes sense that a lot of things would want to hang out there. From a functional perspective, the thalamus is not a single structure. Maybe that makes it even more important. I don't know. That's a matter of opinion. The next most important part, based on size, is the striatum. The word striatum comes from the Latin for striped. Remember these ancient anatomists just kind of digging through a brain and trying to make some sense of it? They came across something that it has stripes on it. So what do you call it? The striped part, of course. Exactly what structures encompass the striatum, you can find a few different answers out there. There is a part called the dorsal striatum, which includes this blob called the putamen and this little hooked part, the caudate nucleus. Sometimes they also include another part called the globus pallidus. There's also the ventral striatum. Sometimes these are referred to as basal ganglia, but that is a bit of a dated term. But we'll just call it the striatum. We'll say these parts, the putamen, the caudate nucleus, and the globus pallidus, are the dorsal striatum, which is often just called the striatum for short. One thing we are certain about the striatum is that it becomes damaged in Parkinson's disease. The main symptom of Parkinson's disease is loss of motor control. Clearly, these are very important parts of controlling movement. We know from other disorders they also seem to be involved in reward conditioning, in addiction and learning. Well, that doesn't narrow it down very much. Clearly, the striatum is a complicated part of the brain, and we know a little about it, but there's still a lot of mystery there. So, any budding neuroscientists, good news for you. Lots of mysteries still to solve. Now we're going to start getting into some smaller parts. What I would say is the 6th most important part of the brain is the hypothalamus. It's only about 0.3% of the brain. The term hypothalamus, hypo means below, and thalamus means the thalamus. So yes, it's the part that's below the thalamus. As you can see, it doesn't really even seem to have a very clear structure. It's just everything sort of below the thalamus that isn't part of the brainstem. But like the thalamus and the brainstem, it seems to handle many different unrelated processes. Luckily, most of those are pretty simple and straightforward, so we know a lot about the hypothalamus. Through damage to the hypothalamus, we know that it is involved in body temperature regulation, regulating sleep, hunger, thirst, digestion. It helps regulate growth and maturation, including reproductive behavior. This will be the first part we discuss that has differences between men and women. There is a place in the thalamus in men that if it is damaged, they will no longer find women attractive. Women, I guess they just look like anybody else at that point. And there is a place in the hypothalamus of women that controls maternal bonding and attachment. It is also important in social dominance and submission, and is key to the fear response. The hypothalamus seems to be just a great big bag of very important involuntary behaviors. In fact, the hypothalamus very commonly, instead of sending electrical signals through nerve cells, it puts chemicals into the bloodstream and is an important part of the endocrine system. The 7th most important part of the brain in size is the hippocampus. How important it is in function, you can decide. It's about 0.3% of the brain, similar to the size of the hypothalamus. And the word hippocampus means seahorse, because I guess if you dissect it and twist it around enough, you can sort of make it look like a seahorse, or I guess it is a little S-shaped, which seahorses are S-shaped, and seahorses are really cool, so yeah, that's fine. It's the seahorse. These can be found in what's called the temporal lobe, which is this little part of the cerebrum right here that sort of sticks out. In fact, if we take it apart, right in here is the hippocampus. Talking about the hippocampus on its own is a little tricky because it is one of these parts that is a critical part of larger processes. For example, there is a circuit in the brain called the Papez circuit that the hippocampus is a major part of, but you can trace processing through the fornix, the mammillary bodies, the mammillothalamic tract, the anterior thalamic nucleus, the cingulate cortex, the entorhinal cortex, and back to the hippocampus again. If we break this at any point, we could cause trouble, which makes it a little hard to focus in very specifically at what the hippocampus does. But when we do that, we discover some very interesting things. There have been several very important patients that have had damage to their hippocampuses, or hippocampi for the fancy, and their injuries have given us insight into what this could possibly be doing. The original patient, HM, or Henry Molaison, had surgery in 1953 to voluntarily remove his hippocampuses in order to treat his epilepsy. This was probably not a good idea because it severely impaired his brain activity. He was no longer able to create long-term memories. If you've seen Finding Dory, you know what I'm talking about.
I suffer from short-term memory loss.
Still, a lot of the brain was removed, and some of his hippocampus was still there. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly if the hippocampus is responsible for the creation of long-term memories. I already said the thalamus is responsible. But in 1981, a Canadian man, Kent Cochrane, had a motorcycle accident that damaged his hippocampuses. And many studies were done to test his mental processes, his behavior, and his thinking to try to figure out what exactly was lost.
Could you please state your name?
Kent Cochrane.
And when were you born?
August 5th, 1951.
So that makes you how old now?
What year is it?
In a summary of his symptoms, it was said the outstanding fact about KC's mental makeup is his utter inability to remember any events, circumstances, or situations from his own life. This includes events and situations before the accident and after the accident. It is commonly misunderstood that losing your hippocampus means you can no longer create long-term memories, but it is clear from Kent Cochrane that you also cannot remember anything, but only a very specific type of memory that is often called episodic memory, where you remember yourself being in a very particular situation. But on top of that, when asked, he cannot tell the questioner what he is going to do later on that day, or the day after, or at any time in the rest of his life. Not only could this unfortunate man not be able to remember any situations, either before or after his accident, he can't imagine himself in hypothetical situations. So what is lost with the hippocampus, which you cannot do if your hippocampus breaks is much more complicated than simply not being able to remember anything. An important part of your consciousness is lost, where you can picture yourself in the past, in the future, or even in the hypothetical present. The eighth most important part of the brain is the amygdala. Makes up a little less than the hippocampus. The word amygdala is Greek for almond. Does it look like this? Is that an almond? Maybe it's without the shell. This is kind of big. It is in the temporal lobe, like the hippocampus, and it is also very close to the striatum. Looks like it's almost part of the caudate nucleus. Now, I say it's 0.28% of the brain, but the truth is it can vary significantly in size. It is much larger in men than women, and it decreases significantly with age. Even the left and right can be slightly different sizes. Okay, so let's break the amygdala and see what happens. According to Neuroscience Online, an open access textbook from McGovern Medical School at the University of Texas, destructive lesions of the amygdala cause tameness in animals and a placid calmness in humans characterized as a flatness of affect. What could be responsible for this kind of symptom? It's possible that the amygdala is involved with the classical conditioning process. What's classical conditioning? Okay. In the 1890s, the Russian biologist Ivan Pavlov was studying digestive secretions in dogs. He'd offer dogs food and then measure their saliva production. He noticed that the dogs would begin to increase saliva production even before he offered food, supposedly by recognizing clues that had normally preceded the feeding. He decided to conduct a formal experiment to study this effect. He would ring a bell just before feeding the dogs. After the bell and the food were associated multiple times, the dogs would begin to increase salivation simply at the sound of the bell, even if there was no food present. What if this process broke? Well, then the bell would just be the same as any other noise. It would no longer be associated with the pleasure of eating that delicious dog food. When the amygdala is looked at more closely, it's discovered there are at least 13 different parts of the amygdala, and they are connected to very different systems. It appears to be another thalamus situation, where this isn't one structure. We can look in parts connect to different areas of the cerebral cortex, some to the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the striatum, the thalamus. Some parts are intimately involved in the sense of smell as well. These parts may be completely unrelated. In a summary of the function of the amygdala in cell, the authors wrote, "Terms such as amygdala combine cell groups arbitrarily, rather than according to the structural and functional units to which they now seem to belong. The amygdala is neither a structural nor a functional unit." Well, gosh, I think, do we know less about the amygdala than we started? The good news is, if you are a budding neuroscientist, don't worry. There is still so much we do not understand about the brain, even the most important parts of the brain. There are plenty of mysteries left to be solved. And that was the top 8 parts of the brain. Originally, I made it the top 10 parts of the brain, but after the amygdala, they kind of got boring. So I pared it down to 8. Now, I think it's a pretty good introduction to the brain in under 30 minutes. I hope it was enjoyable to watch and you learned something. I learned a ton. So much of these videos are just me learning things that are just blowing my mind, and I'm like, how did I not know this? This is incredible, and that makes me want to share it with other people. I assume there are other people out there who are also interested in knowing these things. And so I make these videos for people like me. So I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked it, I'm making lots more like this. I have a few years planned out of about 1 video a month, so please subscribe for more. And until then, please take good care of yourselves and make good decisions.